Hello, everyone. Sorry, my dog was trying to get up on me. This is part two of From American Battlefield Trust, Fort Sumter, where the Civil War began. So, let's get into part two.
Well, that's not that far off base. Your enemy has modern warships out there. You're going to need something of a similar caliber to deter them. So concrete battleships is a pretty good way to make the relation. The guns never fired in anger during World War I or World War II. Occasional practice shots. In fact, one of the few times they fired was the only presidential visit to Fort Sumter. Theodore Roosevelt actually landed on the fort during a visit to Charleston in 1903. The two 12-inch guns roared forth in a salute to the commander-in-chief, and that was one of the few times that the guns fired throughout their lifetime here. Even before the end of World War II, you just didn't need the old big guns on the coast anymore. Submarines, aircraft, largely led to the decline of your coastal defenses. So even in 1943, the Army started to scrap the old coast artillery. They cut up the big guns for scrap metal, and the battery remained vacant after that. So coast artillery had its definite glory days, but World War II was the turning point, and coast artillery was basically phased out after World War II.
And why is that section of the fort painted black versus the brick we see elsewhere?
It's painted black mainly because a lot of the concrete that these batteries were built with wasn't of the highest grade. And they did not put expansion joints in every so often like a modern concrete structure would have. So after a while, the structure started to crack, okay? And when you've got a cracking concrete structure, that means that water can intrude in any place, especially down into the magazines where you have your gunpowder stored. So the black coating is an early attempt at weatherproofing to seal up all the cracks so when it rains, the rain runs off and not seeps through the crack down into the various levels of the battery, such as the powder magazines. So, and it also kind of cut down on glare in, your harsh southern sun. A light brown concrete structure can sometimes set up some glare. And they found that the black coating kind of like dulled things, which made it a little better on the vision.
Okay.
As far as heat, black absorbs heat. So if you're up on top there and there's no breeze, it does get a little toasty. So it does have its advantages and disadvantages, trying to seal the concrete, but it's not climate friendly if you want to stand up there for a long time.
Spoken as a guy who's probably stood up there and had to interp.
I have, and on a good breeze like this, you welcome a good breeze at Fort Sumter.
Okay. So, Gary, our first stop inside the fort is your favorite piece. Tell me about this.
Hey, this is believed to be one of Fort Sumter's original 60 guns. We'll see a lot more throughout the fort, but the Confederates did a lot of moving around of artillery. So some of the stuff that you'll see came in even after the war during a light rearming of the remnant that was left of Fort Sumter. This piece was cast in Boston in 1856. It's a 42-pounder, meaning it'll fire a 42-pound round ball, a distance of about 1.25 miles. This setup that you see right here of the barrel on a replica wooden carriage is what you would have seen in each of the gun rooms.
And I see that it's on a track that allows them to swivel it.
That's right, because remember the fort's purpose in life was fighting ships. And ships out there, ideally, they're going to be mobile lest they become a sitting duck. So as the ships maneuver around out there, the actual gunners in the gun rooms are actually following the movement of the ship. So if you need to swing the carriage a little right or left to get a good shot, you can do that. It'll keep everything nice and greased up, a little manpower and pry bars, and you could swing this whole thing right or left on the tracks.
I also see there are little wooden doors in the windows. What are those for?
Yeah, those would be.
You wouldn't want me to engineer a fort because I wouldn't have thought of that. I would have been flagging the ships. Get back over. No, come back over this way. Even right there. There you go. That would have been terrible.
Embrasure covers. This system of forts originally was designed to have cast iron shutters to where they would open to allow the cannon to fire and then close to prevent any stray cannonball to fly in. The problem is cast iron in a salt environment, not well maintained, especially after the war. A lot of them rusted shut. So it's barely you could find. I think Fort Jefferson on Dry Tortugas has some of the original shutters. Fort Delaware up in south of Philadelphia has some of the original shutters left. But most of the forts are missing their original shutters solely because they rusted in place or have deteriorated and they were taken out. Here we just have a wooden embrasure cover, main purpose, keep people from climbing in at night. So that's not exactly historically correct. Yeah.
The brickwork here is amazing.
It is. That was some good masonry work back then. And it's all load bearing, and a lot of this technology goes back to the Romans because there used to be 2 gun levels above us. And imagine just the weight of the fort and the artillery bearing down on this foundation. If you dug up this floor, you will find an inverted arch underneath us. And that helps in the load bearing. So there's a lot of neat engineering that went into these forts. There's a lot of it you don't even see.
Wow. Wow. Why don't we take a walk around the parade ground and you can show me some more of this incredible architecture?
Well, that would be great. Okay.
So we've talked a lot about Fort Sumter, but why is Fort Sumter important in the first place?
Well, out of the beginning of the Civil War here, you know, a war that definitely reshaped our country. In the beginning, it was just another one of a big fort building program that happened started after the War of 1812, rather. But you know, the Army's building this magnificent chain of forts, and in peacetime, half of them weren't even manned once they were completed, and that's due to the small nature of the core U.S. Army in the pre-Civil War years. You might visit one of Fort Sumter's sister forts in peacetime and walk in and then find a few old men living in the fort as caretakers. That's it. Now imagine that scenario, and the state that fort's in secedes from the Union. So the big question is, who owns the fort the day after? The southern states believed that when they seceded from the Union that they rightfully inherited all federal properties within their states. Folks in Washington vehemently disagreed. No, if it's built for the United States, it remains property of the United States. Regardless of that, it's not enforceable, again, due to the lack of U.S. soldiers. Southern militias easily seized a number of federal properties, arsenals, navy yards, and forts after the secession of the southern states. By the time Abraham Lincoln took office, you know, 7 southern states had formed the Confederate States of America, and there were only 4 forts on the southern coastline that still had the U.S. flag flying over it. Fort Sumter, 2 forts in the Florida Keys, Fort Taylor at Key West, Fort Jefferson on Dry Tortugas, and Fort Pickens off of Pensacola. All the others have been seized by Southern forces. And Abraham Lincoln believes that, boy, we better reinforce and remand these forts before they slip through our fingers. So to resupply and remand these forts, you had to do it by ship, and you had to do it pretty quick. Didn't have time to get the U.S. Navy involved, so the Army basically chartered some ships up in New York City to haul troops and supplies. They sailed south in early April. It was no big secret. Everybody knew that they were heading south to reinforce the 4 forts, and Fort Sumter was the first stop. Yeah, they're going to sail right by Fort Monroe, Virginia, but at the time, Virginia had not seceded from the Union yet. The 2 forts in North Carolina easily taken over by Southern forces. So we're the first time you're going to see the U.S. flag on the southern coastline, and we're the first stop. So the Confederate government was adamant that this effort will fail. The cannons mounted on the islands around us are really the key. Because if Fort Sumter did not surrender before the ships were due in early in the morning of April 12th, then the local forces will fire on the fort. And that's exactly what happened. Firing on the fort before the ships arrived thwarted the effort of Abraham Lincoln to reinforce this fort. The Union Army defended it for 34 hours. Their supplies became exhausted, not only provisions, but ammunition, gunpowder. They called for a ceasefire. Terms were worked out for a safe removal of the U.S. troops via some of the ships that had arrived after the battle started. Remember, these weren't Navy warships. There were no cannons that they could come in and help Fort Sumter or participate in the fight in any way. They just laid offshore, taking up ringside seats to watch the battle. So once the battle was over, a couple of the ships were absconded to evacuate the federal garrison from Fort Sumter, Major Anderson and his men. The ships returned them, took them back to New York City, where the ships had originated. And the Confederates marched in and took over the fort, raised the Confederate flag all in one day. So that's how Fort Sumter actually switched hands. And what that triggered was you had the 34-hour exchange of fire, safe removal of the U.S. troops. But if you put yourself in Lincoln's mind, by firing on this fort, the local forces basically attacked part of the United States. So it doesn't matter that it's in South Carolina in Charleston Harbor. You fire on this fort, you're attacking part of the United States. And that's an action that will not go unanswered. And I don't think again, at that time, that either side fathomed that this wide-ranging, bloody Civil War lasting 4 years in duration will be ahead of them.
So were there any casualties as a result of the April bombardment?
There were not, either side. 0 casualties as a result of the 34-hour bombardment. However, Major Anderson would not leave with all of his men. Part of the negotiations in the giving up of Fort Sumter, Major Anderson's men were allowed to fire a 100-gun salute to the U.S. flag before it's hauled down. On the 47th shot, these men that were probably just dead tired, a cannon accident caused a misfire that killed one of his privates and severely injured a few others. So Private Daniel Howe, who was up at the front of the gun, and remember they're using the guns on top of the fort for the salute, he took a direct blast and killed him on the spot. So he is technically the first casualty of the Civil War, but it wasn't during that 34-hour bombardment. It was after the fact. So you might say friendly fire, but he's still the first of many, many to come.
I don't understand the need for firing the shot unless the Union is doing it to burn up supplies, because a 100-gun shot, like, okay, but if you're doing it, oh man, sorry, I'm eating turkey snack bites and toasted garlic bagel chips, and now I'm getting heartburn. It must have been to burn up supplies. That's the only thing I can think of. And the Confederates might have looked at it like, let them burn it up. Who cares? I'd rather them fire it up in the air than fire it at us. If we can get in there and still get some supplies, that's fine. But the fort is what they want. So I think it was a trade-off. But I wasn't there, so I can't tell you what goes through the mind of the people.
Now, a lot of people don't realize that the Confederates take possession of the fort after that, and then they control Fort Sumter for the duration of the war.
They do. 1862 was pretty quiet for them. The fort's still 50 feet tall. The interior buildings took most of the damage of that initial bombardment that started the war. But the destruction of the fort started in 1863 when Union forces, coming up the coastline from the previously seized Beaufort Hilton Head area, captured Morris Island behind us, mounted your newer, longer range rifled artillery, and then began a siege of Charleston Harbor, basically hitting the city 3 miles from us, and poor old Fort Sumter sitting here point blank range. On a heavy day, they were sometimes hitting the place 500 times a day with projectiles such as one that we see still stuck in the wall here. Now, this is a solid 100-pound Parrott projectile, came from a gun on Morris Island. Most of the destruction that you see was caused by its exploding cousin, called the shell. That would be an empty projectile stuffed with gunpowder and actually had a fuse in the nose. So when it comes flying in, it's going to strike this soft brick. And remember, they're spinning like little drill bits. They're going to burrow the nose into the brick, explode, blowing out huge chunks of the wall. So this is well beyond the capability of the structure to hold up. Remember, this is basically an 1820s design meant to be hit by round cannonballs coming in from ships. Now the fort's being hit from powerful new guns fixed on an island barely a mile and a half away. It's beyond the capability of the structure of holding up very long. The interior buildings destroyed, upper 2 levels of the fort destroyed, and that's why you only see the bottom part of the old fort today remaining out here.
And the Federals do finally come back almost 4 years to the day.
Sure. Amazingly, the Charleston area was under siege for a year and a half, but it wasn't the siege that brought the Confederate flag down here. It was something totally different. It's the huge army of General William Tecumseh Sherman that had been done with Georgia, leaving Savannah, and now moving through South Carolina. This huge army is moving west of the city, basically cutting Charleston off from the rest of the world. The remnant of the Confederate Army that was left here realized that they didn't have any options. They couldn't fight the massive force that is out there, and if they just stayed put, that eventually they would become prisoners of war. So with the coastline still open all the way to North Carolina, on the night of February 17th, the last of the Confederate Army abandoned the Charleston area, which was a very hard, heartbreaking decision to do, to abandon Charleston, the city known as the cradle of secession. So the very next day, Union troops started to walk right in at their leisure. The U.S. Stars and Stripes goes up, and the Civil War is basically over in the Charleston area, February 18th, 1865.
And Major Anderson makes his symbolic return.
And a couple months later, on the 4-year anniversary of taking his flag down and being forced to march out, now Major Anderson, who's been now a brevet major general, he was Major Brevet General now, will carry his flag back and symbolically raise it over the ruins of Fort Sumter on the 4-year anniversary. Yeah.
So give me your 30-second summation of secession that you had told me a second ago.
Basically secession started, think of the country as kind of like a pot that's been simmering for many, many years. You're going to start turning up the heat in the 1850s. You have the election of 1860. Due to the split tickets of the various political parties, the Republicans are going to win the popular vote. Abraham Lincoln's declared the president-elect, and that struck fear throughout planners all across the South. They firmly believed that when the Republican Party took power, that the country would be put on the fast track to the abolition of slavery. And that's something that's going to wreck the Southern economy and do away with the life that they've been used to for many, many years. And that's a path they did not want to go down. So that was really started the secession movement. They believed that the Northern government was just going to interfere with and change the Southern way of life too drastically. They're not going to go down that path. Secession is the way to go. South Carolina led the way December 20th, 1860. Once again in 1861, other southern states will follow in kind of rapid secession.
Very good. I know you have a boat to catch. Is it okay if I stay and explore?
Yes, sir. It would be great. Feel free to look around the fort. There's lots of neat stuff still left out here of various time periods, from the very beginning of the building of the fort through Battery Hugie. Our military history actually ends here in World War II, when the big guns were scrapped in 1943. They had a couple 90 millimeter guns left out here as the last two guns of Fort Sumter. With the coming end of World War II, those guns were taken away and Fort Sumter's military days were over in 1945. The property was transferred to the National Park Service in 1947, a few years later.
I'm going to go explore. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for visiting. It's been great.
I appreciate it.
Take care.
There's a sad postscript to the story of Fort Sumter. On April 14th, 1865, Major General Anderson came back to the fort to raise the flag over the fort that he had surrendered just 4 years earlier. President Abraham Lincoln was invited to that ceremony, but chose instead to stay in Washington because of the fast unfolding events in Northern Virginia. As a result, instead of being here for the ceremony, he had a fateful appointment at Ford's Theater, where he met John Wilkes Booth in what would become his final night.
I didn't pause a whole lot because I was kind of really just into the story. But that was really cool. I really want to go there. A lot of stuff to see. So, we're going to go ahead and end it here because not a whole lot I can contribute. I should have contributed then, but I didn't have anything. So, I hope you enjoyed the start of the Civil War more than the people who, were involved with it. So, you didn't have to fight. That's good. Oh yeah, I forgot at the end of the first video. Subscribe to the channel. That helps. Get a thumbs up. There's a thanks button. You can donate to the channel. Words. And until next time, have a good day, have a good night.